You're listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome back to the CraftsmanOnLine podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, dependent, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, editor-in-chief of CraftsmanOnLine.com. Every time I read that disclaimer, I get a little bit of a laugh, and I'm sure tonight it's going to be one of those episodes where we really have to say these are our own thoughts and not of anybody else, especially with the topic we have and the guest that we have as we welcome back our returning champion, Brother John Nagy. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thanks for having me once again, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
I've had this episode circled on my calendar for a while, mainly because of the topic. We're going to discuss Masonic Unicorn. If you have been following our podcast this year, there was an episode in January of 2022, this year, where we talked about Jacob's Ladder. And that's when Brother Nagy first made the reference to Masonic unicorns sitting around the campfire. And I remember sitting there that night and writing it down on my notepad next to, while we're taking notes here on the show and going, I wonder what that means. And then in preceding episodes, you shortened it to just, oh, well, that's one of those Masonic unicorns. And I remember being like, John, we got to get on the same page with this. So for the benefit of our audience, for our listener, what does Masonic unicorn mean for you? And then I'll follow up with what I thought it meant.
Brother Michael, you have to go back to the origins of Masonic unicorns. About a decade or so ago, it's that long, I was in a multitude of Masonic forums before Facebook got absolutely a tsunami of interest by the brothers. And I remember talking with a brother back channel, because each one of these forums had a private chat. And the brother literally said, you want to watch out for this brother. He literally is talking about riding unicorns around the North Pole, because he has gotten so esoteric in his discoveries that he's now claiming that he has captured and is riding unicorns around the North Pole. And from that particular point on, the Masonic unicorn evolved. First of all, it was a reference to somebody who had gotten so deep down the rabbit hole that they are fantasizing about a reality and adopting the fantasy as their reality, and they know no difference. And then it evolved to people pursuing things that are literally fantastical, if there is such a word, and pursuing it as if it was a true, honest-to-goodness reality that could be obtained. And then it evolved to, well, when we think about the definition we've been giving to unicorns, that applies to a lot of things that are going on within the craft. And then we started looking at all the Masonic unicorns that have grown up in craft lore, where people are pursuing things and acting as if the lore that has been espoused by the craft was actually a reality. I'll cite an example. Hiram Abiff is not the designer of the temple.
We're going to get into some of these myths. Don't give it all away.
All right. Cowans actually are not pretenders.
There we go.
If you look at the history of the craft, you've got literally lodge notes calling people Cowans that were joining the craft as Masons within the structure of the Masonic fraternity. And they were literally labeled Cowan and member. And there's a host of different things, like treating the Hiram Abiff tale as if it were historical and more true than the Bible. There's a multitude of things that are what we now refer to in my circle as Masonic unicorns They're fantastical creatures or belief systems having to do more with the fancy or romance of the craft rather than the reality and history of the craft.
Appreciate that. Yeah,
And so it started out as a reference to somebody who had bridged the gap between fantasy and reality and never returned,
right.
to looking back and kind of stepping back and saying, I wonder how many other things that we as legitimate members of the craft find that there are members who have embraced the lore as if it were history and reality, and forgetting that it's allegory and everything that you see represents something else. Cite an example: King Solomon, King Hiram, and Hiram Abiff. They are characters out of history and or the Bible. But when these historical and biblical figures are inserted into our allegory, that's what is being done, is they are inserting historical or biblical creatures into a mythology, an allegory. It's not reality. It is a story designed to convey a truth by putting historical references or characters where they personify certain attributes. And so when you think of King Solomon, it's not King Solomon out of the Bible. It's a representation of wisdom using the cloak of a character out of the Bible and history.
Right.
And with King Hiram and Hiram Abiff, every single characterization is a personification of a trait, a concept, an ideal, a value. And so if you start looking at three people getting together and only knowing the word, we're talking about a unicorn. If you believe that's the reality,
Right.
it's not communicating history. It is not creating any kind of reference other than it's communicating a truth, but it's not a reality in the sense that it's factual.
Right.
Truth is a reality-based understanding. You embrace a truth. However, how the truth is conveyed, not so often historical.
Well, the first time you used the term, oh, those are the Masonic unicorns sitting around the campfire, it kind of took me back, like I said, and I immediately had a couple of visions like go through my head. First of all, I have a 19-year-old daughter now, but when she was 7, 8 years old, like most little girls, her bedroom was decorated with unicorns and fairies and princess castles. So that came to my mind. But then the idea of unicorns sitting around the campfire. So then I put them in like a Masonic situation where they literally had the jewels of the officers sitting around a campfire doing what? I don't know, roasting marshmallows at this point. And then you said it so quickly and so matter-of-factly that I just kind of was like, okay, he's making a joke here. And then I started thinking about it, and it kind of reminded me of my mother lodge. They used to joke with me all the time and call me Snowflake because I would get so easily upset or offended about things because I was relatively new in the craft and I didn't understand it. And they'd be like, calm down, Snowflake. It's not really this. So I really, and trust me, this is one of those things where I am so thankful that no one's checking my Google searches because I was so nervous having this conversation about unicorns and looking, what did that mean? So just wanted to level set here for our listener. As Brother John pointed out, there are myths about Freemasonry and the craft that exist within our members. They're also in the profane world. These are folks that seek the magic, the fantasy, for lack of a better term, some of the Masonic conspiracy that really can't be confirmed either in the ritual or any of our written work or known work. So tonight, we are going to explore 3 of the most popular Masonic unicorns.
3 of hundreds.
Yeah. Because
and Michael, again, I want to emphasize Masonic Unicorn is not something that you're going to hear in any Freemasonic circles, any Grand Lodge. This is something that just popped up over the web a decade or so ago. And the individuals who had frequented these forums, some of them actually will remember the mention of a Masonic unicorn and they will giggle. Now what's happening is by you interviewing me on this, everybody's going to be in on the story. And when you start hearing Masonic Unicorn being floated around because of this podcast, you're going to know it all started out with me and another brother just kind of rolling our eyes at this brother literally bragging about capturing and riding unicorns around the North Pole. And it's like, oh, another Masonic Unicorn story.
Well, the marketing genius in me is thinking, you know what we should have done first was created a Masonic Unicorn t-shirt through CraftsmenOnLine.com and then had the pod. We put the unicorn ahead of the campfire.
95.
So yeah, for the benefit of our audience tonight, we're going to be talking about some of the three biggest. But the other thing is that now if you go back and you listen to episodes or continue to stick with us for future episodes,
and don't just go about away after this particular episode.
Well, just about every discussion that we've had, from speculation of the letter G to Jacob's ladder to Cowan's. We're going to do an episode in a few weeks on the Ruffians, and you're going to hear this term. Oh, well, the Masonic Unicorns believe this, and now you'll understand it. So let's start first with one of, I would say, the biggest. This is, I mean, for us in the craft and for those that are outside of it that are so hard trying to connect this. What I'll do, John, is I'm going to set up what the myth is, the unicorn, and then you can jump in and dissect it. Does that sound good? Okay. All right. So the first one that we're going to get into tonight is the Knights Templar. And we are all familiar with the history of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, how they protected Europeans on their pilgrimage to the Middle East well after the Crusades. Brother Nagy, your job here, help us through this myth that's associated with the Templars and Freemasonry. And I guess the other question that so many of us want to try to connect is Templar symbology and the traditions that were somehow revived by Freemasonry in the late 18th century.
Keep in mind that we started out with a few scripts that were put together around 1717 when the Premier Grand Lodge came into being. Modern day Masonry was created. They created a franchise and they took the scripts, they policed all the different literatures, and they pulled together as much as they could at the time. And they created a ceremony. There was only one. It was the apprentice ceremony. And when you came in, you were a full-fledged member. And then if you wanted to run a lodge, you had to go through what it was called the master's part. Now, get this. The master's part was to create not a master mason, but a master of a lodge. The apprentice was put through this master's part to become the master of a lodge. But it was a master's part, not a master mason part, but a master part to create a fellow craft for the purposes of running a lodge. Got that? Then what happened was the Premier Grand Lodge found out that they had to create one fellow craft after the other. So what they did was, to solve the problem of having to create all these, they put the burden on the lodge by splitting the apprentice degree into two. So now you had the apprentice degree and a fellow craft degree, so that the lodges could put on the fellow craft degree and create the possibility of having somebody master a lodge. And it was around 1725 that the Master Mason degree came out, but it wasn't required. It was just something that a few Masons who had the finances to go through it went through, but it wasn't a part and parcel of the complete membership requirement. So what happened here is, as things unfolded and the popularity increased, more and more degrees were being created, because the members were sitting around saying, well, there's got to be more plays that we could put on, because there's got to be more light that we can reveal. And you wound up at one particular point having two Grand Lodges competing, and you had basically a very Christian slant on one of them and a very generic on another. And as a result, you wound up having the York Rite degrees created. And then you wound up having the beginnings of the Scottish Rite. You had a bunch of degrees that were spurious degrees that ultimately wound up becoming the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. And At one particular point, there was a tremendous interest in the Knights Templar, and the writers of our plays interwove into our lore a connection with the Knights Templar because you had a tremendous Christian influence in one of the Grand Lodges. And as a result, the people who were wanting to role play the fantasy of being Knights Templars had an opportunity to go through degrees that were Knights Templar oriented. And you have this influence even permeating into the Scottish Rite if you are a Scottish Rite aficionado. And so you have both rites embracing some aspects of the Knights Templar. However, mainstream Masonry started around 1717 with the franchising of lodges and Grand Lodges around the world. And as it grew, more and more demand for more and more plays ensued. And what they did was they created more and more lore for the individuals who were interested in these topics to participate and role play in. So when we go back to the topic of the Masonic Unicorn, these degrees are symbolic. They're not historical. At best, you might be able to prove that Knights Templar were somehow either sponsoring and or participating at some level in stonecraft. But as far as Freemasonry is concerned, they weren't connected with our organization.
Right.
They were borrowed by our organization. The lore, the history, the symbolism, the terminologies, they were all borrowed. As masterful playwrights do, what they do is they do their research, they pull their information together, and they create plays that are extremely believable and influential. But I go back to the analogy, if you've ever gone back into the 60s and 70s television program Dragnet, Dragnet was a fantastic production. If you wanted to get the skinny on at least a romantic side of being a police officer in a certain location at a certain amount of time, Dragnet had actors portraying detectives and police officers, and they portrayed different scenarios having to do with what police officers would normally encounter day in and day out. Now, was Jack Webb a police officer or a detective? No, he was playing the role of one on television, and very convincingly for the average person. Well, we're members of a theatrical society with a moral purpose, and we've got some wonderful, wonderful scripts, very believable, very enticing. It draws people into the reality. And if you want to role play, the organization gives you full permission to take it to any level that you want. The problem is if you lose sight that you are role playing this and you actually become what you've done is you've swept yourself away. Now, is that a Masonic unicorn or are you just living the role?
Right. I think for tonight's discussion, the important part here is we're going to have brothers that are like, well, they're so extreme in the view that it's real, that it exists, that they can connect it because maybe there's a document here or there, but it's not what we would consider sourced or qualified material. And when you have a panel of experts who have done the research, historians who have combed through the records and cannot make these connections, I think the one thing that we're trying to make as a point tonight with this Masonic Unicorn conversation is that if you want to believe it to be true, then you need to do your research and prove the rest of us wrong. Because for those of us that have, I think all of us that got into Freemasonry are like, oh, wow, there's this cool story. And then how far down do you get to the rabbit hole where you're like, I can't find any connection here? As you said, at best, there's a loose connection here or here, but nothing that says at this time, at this place, this happened. It just doesn't exist.
And what separates out the role playing from the actual Masonic Unicorn is when you get lost in the role and you lose sight that it is a role that you are embracing and living, where you don't realize that this is not reality, this is not history, and you start literally arguing with brothers to the point where you're driving them away because they understand things differently, but you've so embraced it that it becomes your reality as opposed to the role that you've chosen to take on.
Right.
I can play very convincingly the role of speculative Mason in Lodge when I'm asked to, but I'm not fooling myself into believing that I'm actually somebody who is the inheritor of stonecraft. No.
Right.
Speculative masonry is an inheritance of something far greater than stonecraft. We use the symbolism and lore of stonecraft, but we also use a tremendous amount of philosophy and theology that goes far beyond what the stonecrafters were doing.
So you used another expression, and we're going to move to the second Masonic Unicorn myth tonight, where you talked about playing a part or actors in a play. And our second Masonic Unicorn is Hiram Abiff, the widow's son, who is a central figure in Freemasonry's allegory in the building of King Solomon's Temple. From the first reference of King Solomon's Temple and Hiram Abiff in Cook's manuscript in the earliest 15th century, many Masons have sought to try to connect Hiram's origin to biblical figures in the Old Testament. Now, if the Templars didn't get you, I'm imagining there's brothers going, what? Our most ancient Grand Master, Hiram Abiff, was not a Freemason? He was not a real person? He's a unicorn? Where is the disconnect in the Hiramic legend and reality in this case?
What little that is written in the Bible is he was a silversmith more than anything else. He was a metal worker, which should bring a smile to some of the brothers' faces who know certain words within Freemasonic degrees. The point where we're told he was the architect, no, God was the architect designer. David wrote it down, handed it to his son Solomon, and Hiram Abiff was there more as a foreman to make sure that the plans and the architecture of the design was put forth. And this is what we get from the biblical side and historical side. So when you hear about Hiram Abiff and you hear brothers start saying, well, that it's more true than the Bible, that's a unicorn. They drank the Kool-Aid. Things like the widow's son, it's a beautiful metaphor, beautiful allegory, a beautiful Easter egg that goes back to Ruth and Boaz. And when you understand the true understanding of the Ruth tale, Boaz was responsible for basically impregnating the widow to create a widow's son so that the very land that Boaz purchased could be inherited by the son that he just created with the widow. So he created a widow's son literally to inherit his land. And what happens is the widow's son actually has a different name that is going to be going by because he would not be considered Boaz's son. So when you see all the different things that are going on, you recognize that there's a message here, but it's allegorical, and that we are the inheritors of a very, very profound, rich heritage that started around 1717. So when it comes to Hiram, unless you can go past the actual verbiage and the lore and look at the rich symbolism that is being conveyed, you're embracing a unicorn and not the reality of what is really being conveyed by ritual.
Yeah. I think Hiram, for me, and I think many brothers, when you go through the third degree and the Hiramic legend comes to you, you're like, oh, this is supposed to be the story of Freemasonry. And you walk out of the room that afternoon or that night going, now I know what Freemasonry is all about. And then when you go back and start studying the ritual, maybe you're taking a part in a degree, or you finally decide to pick up a book and go through everything, you're like, wait a second, they keep using this word allegory. And then you talk to other brothers and you're like, no, Hiram, there's maybe a sentence or so mentioned of him in the Bible. He was never this what it was. And I remember for me was when I was trying to find Hiram Abiff, and that's, I think, one of the first times that I reached out to you, and I'm like, wait a second, Noah used to be the central figure in the third degree. Where did this Hiram person come from? You shocked me with the answer. They invented him. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they made him up. Like, I was so convinced that he was a real person up to that point.
And this is where you have a tremendous disconnect with a lot of members within the fraternity. They come in and they don't know history. They don't know their Bible. They don't know allegory. And then they're given an opportunity in the second degree where they're basically directed to learn the trivium and quadrivium. And the vast majority of brothers think, oh, well, that's great. You know, that's really important. But they're focused on getting a title, not earning a title. They want the title bestowed upon them. So when they get to the third degree, because they have not studied the trivium, at least the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, well, they don't understand what allegory is because they've not done the study. They've not done the work. They've not climbed the stairs in any way, shape, or form other than just a rudimentary education that they received in grade school and even in college.
Right.
So they come in and they experience this rich, this unbelievably saturated story reeking with allegory and symbolism and metaphor. And it's like a lot of other things that are done in our life that we aren't prepared for. They take it literally.
Right.
Because they don't know how to take it any other way. And so they ask questions. And of course, you've got the illiterate teaching the illiterate at that particular point, or shall I say, the symbolically challenged teaching the symbolically ignorant. And what happens is you wind up having generation after generation missing the entire point of the allegory. You got three characters representing three ideals, and the three ideals literally put in place in your life by doing the work that's pointed out by the first and second degree.
Right.
And so you'll never have beauty unless you get knowledge and the foundation. You bring order to the chaos of your heart. I've said this before. And then you've got to bring order to the chaos of your head. And that's through the fellowcraft work. And you've just installed, by doing the work, knowledge or strength and wisdom. And what's left is beauty. But you're not going to get the beauty until you've laid the foundation for the other two.
Right.
So literally, the master's word will be hidden from that member forever. And they will accept a substitute after substitute, believing that they have achieved the goal by not doing the work.
Right. And the point you made is so strong and profound, because once you understand that Hiram Abiff was not a real person, for lack of a better term, was not a Freemason, but represents a character or a personality or an idea.
Personification of an ideal.
Right.
Yeah.
Then when you sit in lodge, and I think for brothers that hear this podcast, tell me what happens. The next time you go to lodge and you watch the opening and the closing of the lodge, now you'll understand the importance of this and the play that Brother John speaks about so much, the parts that they're performing, what that really means. And now the real meaning of Hiram Abiff, just in the words that the junior warden says. I like how you put it as like a foreman, but also kind of what his roles and responsibilities are, wink, wink. Now you're going to go, oh, and how Hiram Abiff is really, as the junior warden, you are personifying that as a master mason. And that's really what your job is supposed to be. But his job is to remind you how to do it.
And when you look at the roles of each officer, it is wisdom that opens the lodge, not the worshipful master. The worshipful master takes on the role of King Solomon, and King Solomon represents wisdom. So it's wisdom that opens the lodge, and wisdom talks to strength, and strength talks to beauty, and so on and so forth. And if you get lost in the metaphor, lost in the allegory,
I think with those connections, that's enough to get brothers that are trying to figure out, like, what are they talking to go, okay, so think about these words. And I'm very interested in hearing feedback from brothers as to if now you think of the part of Hiram Abiff or junior warden or the role of our first, ancient operative Grand Master, how that comes to you. Let's quickly move to our third Masonic Unicorn tonight. And Brother John has talked about this several times on our podcast, but it's the Master's Word, or we've done an episode on it called the Lost Word, which is the genuine secret of a Master Mason that was said to be lost during the death of Hiram Abiff. So if we've already made the point that Hiram Abiff really wasn't a real person, he's an allegory, a character, a representative, then what is the secret that exists in this word. And one of the most profound points that you've made, Brother John, is that you cannot speak the lost word. So why is there this endless pursuit of this myth that is so integral in all of the appendant bodies of Freemasonry?
Because the vast majority of members haven't done the very work that degrees point them to doing. And as a result, they, very much like the Ruffians, are looking for something that can be handed over to them. If they pay the right fee, if they go through the right degree, they'll get their reward. And just like the Ruffians, what happens is they will go to their deaths not understanding what it is that they're really pursuing. Because without doing the work, you really won't understand what the master's word actually is and what has been lost. And I'll cite you an example. In my most recent book, The Craft Mastered, I purposely treated the lost word, the master's secrets, as one and the same. And the fact of the matter is, I was going along with convention at that point. However, I left a sprinkling of hints throughout the entire book that they were not the same. If anything, if you read the book, you'll understand that you have to first obtain the secrets of a master mason, and that's by doing the work. You can only have those secrets by doing the work, and the work is clearly spelled out in the Entered in Fellowcraft degree. And the master's word is brilliantly hidden in plain sight in the Trestle Board lecture. If you understand what the Trestle Board lecture is all about, you understand what the master's word is. It's a two-part theology. It's a two-book theology. You've got the Holy Writ, a volume of sacred law, however you want to refer to it, is the volume of sacred law that is on the altar as one of the three great lights. But that's only one part. And there's no way on God's green earth you're going to understand the Lord's word, the master's word that's in that book, unless you have studied profusely the trivium. The second book is the book of nature. And the book of nature can only be understood by studying the quadrivium. So if you study the trivium, you've got half the master's word. If you studied both the trivium and the quadrivium, you have all the secrets to understanding the full breadth of the master's word. And yet you have these Masonic unicorns. Let me go through some of the Masonic unicorns. The temple's never completed. That's a Masonic unicorn. The temple is completed by doing foundational work and the stair-step climbing. And if you're a Mason, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The work is never done. Well, we're not talking about work in general. We're talking about specific work, and that work is to complete the temple. You'll always be an apprentice. Well, God help you if you've got that philosophy, because the fact of the matter is an apprentice is supposed to lay their foundation. That is the only work that they are required to do, is lay the foundation when it comes to speculative masonry. If you were an operative mason, they did all the grunt work.
Right.
But we're not operative masons, so we've got to look at this speculatively. And the only work that an entered apprentice is supposed to be doing is laying the foundation. That is their sole purpose in being an apprentice. And the Fellowcraft, because we have divided this into three rather than two, the Fellowcraft really is completing the apprentice work, which is learning the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And it's funny that it wasn't until I had written the book that I realized, because the Fellowcraft was inserted into this, and actually split off from the original apprentice work, what happens is all of it is apprentice work. So you've got apprentice work number 1, which is the foundation, apprentice work number 2, which is the Fellowcraft, climbing the stairs, doing the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And once you've completed your temple by doing all this, then you've got all the secrets that allow you to pursue reading the Trestle Board, which is the master's word. And all the mythology and all the unicorns that have just literally grown up around this mythology. If you are given anything that is a lost word, it's not the master's word. because the master's word is clearly spelled out, alluded to, so to speak, by the trestle board lecture.
Right.
And the problem is that because so many brothers have not done apprentice work stage 1 and apprentice work stage 2, or what we call the fellowcraft work, what happens is they're pursuing something that they think is something that could be grabbed hold of. And the problem is the only thing you can grab a hold of is the disciplines that are pointed out that have to be internalized by the fellowcraft and apprentice work. And that's what you have to grab hold of. And then what happens is once you've grabbed hold of it, done the work, it grabs hold of you, and it permits you to understand the master's word. And anything else is just a Masonic unicorn. It's all fable, it's all fantasy from beginning to end. And if you are handed something, it's still a substitute. It's not the real thing.
Right. Just for my own entertainment purposes, one night I had a conversation with a brother until about 3:00 in the morning, where we had this same back and forth on the different, and it started out with, okay, if it was such an important and secretive thing, how come guys that just have to pay to be a member of this body get to know this and go through this degree? Well, because you've been well recommended, all of the things we're supposed to say, right? And then I said, okay, let's digest this a little bit more. If it's ineffable, if it can never be spoken, if our minds cannot conceive it and our tongue and mouth could not produce the words, even then, if we knew the name, what's the point? It's not like he's the genie in Aladdin's lamp that we can just summon and he's going to come and work for us. Like, it's not going to change that relationship at all whatsoever.
The acid test is pretty well clearly spelled out in the 3rd degree. The reason why they wanted the secrets is to travel to foreign countries or foreign lands, to work, earn as master masons and earn master's wages. And although not in the tail, it's also to support and contribute. Well, by just knowing a word, I go into a foreign land, I spout out this word, instantly I'm going to get master's work. I'm going to get master's wages. I'm going to support and contribute. No, it doesn't work that way. And the other thing is that something very important that I discovered is that if I want to go to foreign lands and work and earn master's wages, I have to be able to provide to both a member of the fraternity, somebody who knows what I'm capable of doing, but I also have to be able to do the very same thing with somebody who has absolutely no clue about the fraternity, because they're the ones that are going to be paying me master's wages. If I cannot produce a masterpiece for the person that is going to be paying me master's wages, what's the point? And do I need 2 other people tagging along in order to make sure that we act this out so that the profane person knows that we know the master's word so that they can pay me master's wages? Again, it's an allegory. It's conveying some profound truths. And if you don't get past the metaphor and you think that it's a reality that you're going to actually get a word that is going to permit you to do this, but you have to have 2 other people tagging along to be able to enact it out, it gets to the point where, no, that's Masonic Unicorn. That's romanticism. You're missing the entire point.
Right. Again, and I think to that, I think the point is that if you know the name, the goal of this is to bring you closer to having a better relationship with the grand architect. That's really I'm thinking that's the goal, is that, okay, now I can put this in my mind and I can start visualizing this. It's not to summon or have great, amazing power and be, the Wizard of Oz, for lack of a better term. It's so that you can sit here and say, okay, I can, in my mind, maybe I'm able to have a conversation, or it's bringing me closer to that thing that I'm seeking.
I want to go one step further into this rabbit hole with you. The master's word is not a euphemism. It is a way of communicating something, very much like when you say the term kick the bucket, not playing with a full deck. lost some marbles. These are terminologies and phrases that are communicating something far beyond the literal. You kick the bucket, you're actually saying you're dead. Lost some marbles, you're not cognitively there. Playing with a half deck, same thing. Sleeping with someone, you're not sleeping with somebody. If anything, you're quite awake. And yet, the terms that are used to express an ideal that everybody understands. Well, when we're talking about the master's word or the lost word, we're doing the same thing. It is a term that is being used to describe something utterly different. However, it has close resemblance to what I'm about to share. In the beginning, God spoke everything into existence. We refer to God as the Lord in some faiths. We even refer to him as the master. And so when we think of God speaking into existence, all that is, his words literally conveyed reality, and all of existence are his words. And if all of existence are his words, the master's words, then in order to understand or get a hold of the master's word, you have to first be able to comprehend all that God has written and spoken into existence. And so when you start looking for the master's word, well, you're really not looking for it. What you're trying to do is understand the reality that has been written in front of you by God, verbalizing from the very beginning existence. So we have some of that captured in the Holy Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, the Quran, the Torah, the Tanakh. I mean, even the Bhagavad Gita, these are all inspired works. And you have to understand the trivium in order for you to understand them, because there's so much hidden within each and every one of them that if you took them literally, you miss the point. So you have to have a strong rhetorical understanding of what's being written. And of course, that is the inspired word of God that was inspired for men to write down on paper. But that is only half of it. The rest is looking at all reality, just looking around and saying, well, that's what man wrote in, inspired by God. However, what we have in front of us when we look around is what God spoke into existence, or his verbal writing. I look out the window, I see birds. God spoke those birds into existence. And that is his writing. And as is everything else. So when we hear the master's word and we try to take it literally, that's your Masonic unicorn. You can't take it literally. Well, you can, but then you're chasing Masonic unicorns, actually capturing them, say, yeah, I've got one. I've got a Masonic unicorn. And it's a great, what are you going to do with it? I mean, is it going to improve your life any? However, if you take the time to embrace the secrets, learn the secrets, internalize the secrets, and then look around at all that has been created by God himself, what happens is you now are able to look into the master's word and try to understand what is plainly hidden in plain sight.
Well, I feel pretty good about this episode. we uncovered 3 of the biggest Masonic unicorns out there: Templars, Hiram, Abiff, Master's Word. And I feel like there's plenty more sitting around the campfire, but at least we identified a few.
And we'll probably bring up a few more as other episodes unfold if we still have our listening audience.
I hope we do. Otherwise, it's just you and me every couple of weeks, which I'm fine with.
I'm enjoying it.
I want to thank again our reoccurring champion, my friend and yours, Brother John Nagy, who will be back in 2 weeks, and we'll be talking about some characters that we mentioned tonight as far as Masonic unicorns go, but in a different light with the plight of the Ruffians. So be here for that later this month. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.